I would be remiss if I didn't report that today, January 25, in 1947, Al Capone died of the effects of syphilis. On March 20, 1940, he left Baltimore. He'd been up there at Johns Hopkins getting treatment. Um, by the way, I've gone by his house that he rented up there. It's an enormous thing, really big, beautiful, tree-lined street, beautiful home. Anyway, he left to go to his Palm Island state down in Florida. The syphilis made him cold constantly, even in Florida, it was cold. In 1942, the world discovered that penicillin can do a number of things, but mostly it could help with syphilis. But the war was on, and so anyway, they started to mass produce it. But the war was on, and guys needed that. GIs were being shot up in Europe and in the South Pacific, needed the penicillin to keep their wounds clean and so forth. And then after that, the penicillin went to civilians, and then last on the line were people like Capone. So he got it. When he did get it in 42, the brain damage was so far advanced that all that the penicillin could do was just slow down the disease. The after effect of slowing down the disease was that by 1943, his doctor, Joseph Moore, said that he's in Baltimore, said that Capone is becoming more and more childlike. And at this point is when Jake Guzik had made his infamous statement after he went down to see Al Capone in Florida. And he came out and he was on the lawn. There's a place covered with news guys. And he said offhandedly, maybe he didn't know he was going to be quoted. I think he was a little shocked at the Al Capone he saw because Capone had been in prison for years and then he hadn't seen him and he went down to Florida to see him. And there's this really a different human being. He said, Al is nuttier than a fruitcake. He tried later on, he realized that came out a lot harsher than I think he intended. And in this garbled message he put out, he basically said, "Look, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. That was harsh. I didn't mean it that way." But Capone really had he became more and more childlike as the years went by and by and by, and they had to take care of him. He would wander was one of the things he would do, so they had to keep track of him. You think about his wife, May Capone, a hell of a woman, huh? She stayed with him through thick and thin of it, boy. Anyway, he spent his last years in the mansion on Palm Island. His wife and his grandchildren were around. His son was around, of course. On January 21, 1947, he had a stroke. He regained consciousness and he started to improve, but then he got bronchitis pneumonia and he suffered another heart attack on January 22 and another one on January 25 when he was at this point, surrounded by his family. His heart stopped due to a stroke he had while he was sleeping. They transported him back to Chicago a week later. They had a private funeral. He was buried at I never say this correctly, Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago. But in 1950, they picked him up. They picked up the corpse. They moved it, the coffin rather, and moved it so he could be with his family, his father, his brother Frank. Frank was gunned down in the attempts to take over a town. They moved him to the Mount Carmel Cemetery, what I've heard is the Boot Hill of Chicago. I'd like to go there and see some of those graves. It's pretty impressive. In this, the mob bosses said, look, he sent a message out, don't go. Nobody goes to the funeral. Just stay away. It was a frigid, freezing, awful day, too. So I don't know if people would have churned out to do that. Bear in mind, what was it, 47? He fell out of power in 1933, thereabouts. A lot of his guys were gone. They were dead. They were in jail. Life goes on. And the only people who would have shown up had it not been such a god-awful day was the public, rubberneckers. But the bosses of the mob put word out, don't go. Nobody's going to this guy's funeral. We've got enough. They were under a lot of scrutiny at the time. We don't need more.